So we have some global programs where we're looking at drought mitigation, flood mitigation, as well as community-based programs going down to looking at ways to get climate information out to disparate populations. It could be involving things along the lines of getting some climate information out to women who are deciding when to dry their batiks, for example. Do I dry them this week or do I dry them next week? And try to downscale some of those global sources of data to help inform livelihood decisions, as well as looking at evacuation planning and things along those lines. So OFDA's disaster risk reduction programs, as you can imagine, mostly have focused on the protection of lives, but livelihoods coming in as very, very soon after. And my colleague, as Kelly had mentioned, Cezine Tokar is our point of contact there. For those of you familiar with the Famine Early Warning System, is anybody familiar with that USAID program in the audience? So Famine Early Warning System basically has its basis within the Food for Peace Office to help make informed decisions about when food aid should be brought out to a particular country. One, to not disrupt local markets, to meet particular cultural needs, to be aware of agricultural commodity coming off of local fields along those lines, as well as to be aware of the market conditions as well. And of course, including climate data. This is a some 25-year program that has had some interesting pieces in that while the nascence of this program was to again deliver information to the food aid program within USAID Washington to know how and when and where we can deliver our food aid. But what we've been able to do then is to look back on these 25 years of data and do basically some hind casting or some modeling based upon the fact that we've had information on ag productivity, on health outcomes, on market access, and as well as on some climate data. And we were able to go back and say, this is when a famine occurred here in this particular part of Ethiopia. And we can then go back and look at the data and start to come up with some predictive models to be able to begin to downscale some of the global climate models to a local setting, as well as there's, as you can imagine, a lot of local livelihood information. So we understand, for example, in Ethiopia, there's been some very good work. We understand the climate vulnerability, if you will, of a particular livelihood scheme. Therefore, we can have a better sense of some adaptation measures. Democracy and governance, I really just see this as a key part of climate change. Is the government able to deliver services from a legitimacy and effectiveness and perceptions of that government? Climate change adaptation is a service. It's a service to the country and to the community. So within USAID, as we're thinking about how can we best address and mobilize our expertise, we're really putting together the physical science expertise of that disaster risk reduction and the famine early warning system data points, as well as we've got tremendous expertise, as many of you do in your host organizations as well, in democracy and governance via just a governance and political administration, transparency, accountability, effectiveness of these administrations, from a civil society perspective of allowing the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable, for example, to have voice. This is what Kelly was referring to in the RED strategy, the idea that if we don't involve some of these vulnerable populations in the discussion about how decisions are being made, we're going to be missing out. We have a potential to do harm. So civil society plays a very important role there. And then just rule of law in terms, pardon me for cutting that off, in terms of so many of these issues are going to have to do with land grievances, land disputes, and things along those lines. So we see that as an important role in my colleague David Black in the DG office. And then conflict as well. We have expertise. It's a fairly new office. It's only maybe about 5 or 7 years old within USAID. But this is another area that we see as an integral role of how we're going to be looking at climate change adaptation as well to avoid, again, tripping some of these fault lines, et cetera. And I can talk more about some of those specific projects if you like. So then the impact assessment piece, I know we have a lot of impact assessment professionals here. Within USAID, we adhere to our National Environmental Policy Act here in the U.S. government through 22 Code of Federal Regulations 216. That's simply under the NEPA statute. That is our regulation regulation of how we carry out environmental impact assessment process. It is also the reason I have a job. I happen to be one of these Bureau environmental officers, so that's how USAID has a mechanism for oversight. But I have a responsibility for basically about a $2 billion portfolio. So it's not just me in and of myself. I have colleagues in all of our field missions overseas, of which USAID has quite a large presence, as you know. So that process of undergoing the environmental impact assessment, yes, it is. I look at it as I'm an optimist, I think, in a certain way. I look at it as the carrot and the stick approach. And but I have to say, for those of us who are doing EIA work, that the stick approach is an absolute necessity, even though we obviously want to look to the carrots and look for incentives as well. So just briefly in terms, I think this is my final slide, about how some ways that USAID is thinking about going forward in this area. We can call it mainstreaming, we can call it integration, we can call it cross-sectoral, and yet we all know what that can look like. It becomes a tragedy of the commons and nobody pays attention to it. But I think we can be strategic in a way that we do our integrated funding if we limit our integrated programs, rather, if we limit our scope to a particular area. So one area that we're looking at again within USAID, focusing kind of on a pro-poor climate change adaptation methodology, again, bringing to bear our physical and social science expertise. Another piece that increasingly, as I think especially as a result of our meeting that we had yesterday, which was a stakeholder analysis, we'd like to begin to evaluate how to look at an integrated assessment approach across humanitarian assistance, climate change, and impact assessment. Again, my main role is as an impact assessment professional, and I really see that for our climate change programs, USAID has some funding for climate change right now, but even so, we're also in the process of developing a strategy that will look, on a 5-year and beyond kind of a time horizon. I very much see that we have a certain role that we can look at our standalone programs, if you will, that we have immediate programming, immediate climate change funds for. We have a role that we can play there. Then we have money that we're using to try to influence other programs. We have programs in agriculture, in food security, in global health. We're seeking to influence those programs. But even as those of you who work in large organizations know, the climate change money is always going to be smaller than monies for these other engagements. Even so, of all the food security programs, we're only going to be able to influence a certain percentage of all of those food security programs. This is a reality that we live in. So I have to say, we know that there's issues and concerns. I'm talking to people who know this well within the impact assessment professionals. We know there's issues with the environmental impact assessment process, but I truly see that if we begin to build in a very considered manner, based upon an initial scoping, certain climate change aspects into our environmental impact assessment process, I think that we can start to help trigger some other analyses. It will never replace a full-on climate adaptation vulnerability analysis, but it can begin to help us start to get into the methodology. We know that change takes a very long time because it's essentially behavior change of us and organizations, let alone at a technical and a field level. And then finally, again, within this larger climate change strategy for the agency that I'm involved in, we are increasingly building in that do no harm capacity, do no harm principle that Kelly was mentioning. The idea being that those of us looking at environment programs, we know those environment programs can have risks as well. And so I think that's a really important component for us to consider also. That's all I have.